Have you ever watched one of Nick Carver's entertaining panoramic photography on location videos and thought, I want a 6x17 camera, but then you realize how expensive they are. Maybe this Dayi 6x17 panel back for 4x5 cameras is the solution. In this video, I'll discuss my experience using this accessory over the course of 11 years and show you some of my most recent 6x17 work from Zion National Park to help you make a more informed decision. As a matter of full disclosure, I am not sponsored by Dayi or any other manufacturer that I mentioned in this video. I purchased all of the equipment with my own money. Any thoughts or opinions I express belong to this guy. If the equipment performs poorly, I'll let you know about it, but I'll do it in a tactful manner. For those of you who have been long-term followers of my channel, you might recall that I made an entire video on this Dayi 6x17 Pano accessory in 2014. Things have certainly changed a lot around here, like making sure that our grandfather clock isn't chiming during the filming of one of my videos. If you want to watch that video, I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's a doozy. So why make a follow-up video? Well, now that I've been using this panel back for 11 years, there are some quirks and nuances that I believe are important to understand that I didn't emphasize in my first video. Additionally, I needed a platform to continue my discussion from my last video about photographing the washes on the east side of Zion National Park using expired film. So I figured this is the perfect time to create something new. If you like to watch that video, I'll leave a link to that video in the description as well. Let's get started with the gear. We all love camera gear, don't we? For those of you who are new to these types of panel backs, they have two main components. There's the ground glass back that allows you to compose your image and dial in your focus, and then there's the film back, which holds your roll film, typically 120 film. These backs are specifically designed to attach to what is known as a Graflok or international back. You simply remove the ground glass and lock the back into place. It's important to remember that if you don't have this specific type of Graflok back on your 4x5 camera, you will not be able to use it on your view camera. This was initially the case with my Zone 6 Studios view camera. However, I circumvented that problem by purchasing a used Graflok back off of eBay and making a wooden frame to accommodate the Graflok back to be able to attach it to my large format camera. If you'd like to see how I made that wooden frame and attach the Graflok back, I'll leave a link to my in-depth video in the description. My particular version of the Dayi 6x17 panel back also came with blackout panels to reduce the size of the panel during exposure to either 6x12 or 6x14 centimeters. Just be aware that once these blackouts are installed, you are committed to shooting the entire roll with whatever size you've chosen. Quite frankly, I've never experimented with using these because I figure if you're going to shoot a pano, why not take advantage of the full 6x17 experience? You always have the option to crop the image later. Yes, I know you can squeeze out one more frame from your roll of 120 film, but that doesn't outweigh the uniqueness of the 6x17 format, at least for me. Interestingly, I recently had a conversation with Chris Darnell about the 6x12 versus 6x17 format, and we both agreed that the 6x17 ratio brings a very special compositional quality to images that distinguishes them from smaller panoramas. So if you like panos, you'll need to decide what ratio suits your shooting style best. Or maybe just mix it up and shoot them all. By the way, I just want to take a moment to let you know that Chris Darnell not only knows where to get good eats in Salt Lake City, but he also has a ridiculously great YouTube channel where he goes on traveling adventures and shows us his awesome large format digital and aerial photographs. Please check out his generous contributions to the photographic community on his channel. After you watch this video to the end, of course. In terms of the durability, I have not had any major problems with this panel back whatsoever. It's a solid hunk of metal and kind of heavy, but tolerable. That's not to say that it doesn't have quirks. For example, these metal latch hooks are a bit soft and do easily bend. So I have learned to be extra careful with them when I reinsert the cover onto the film back. Maybe this has changed in the newer models, but just be aware of that if you purchase an older unit. In fact, I would just be careful with any model you purchase to be on the safe side. The only minor problem that I've experienced with this panel back is that the adhesive holding the light seal in place lost its adhesive properties. This resulted in the string coming loose from the inner part of the light trap. This could have easily been repaired by using some fresh glue, but I never bothered reinstalling it because I know my thick fingers would make that task a tedious process. So did I take my panel back to the local scrap metal yard for recycling? Nah. The design of the back is recessed, which creates an innate light trap very similar to that of the typical standards found on large format cameras for lens and back attachments. Basically, it was simply an added layer of protection against light leaks. After running hundreds upon hundreds of rolls through this panel back, I am happy to report that I have never once complained about a light leak from the missing seal. However, just as a precaution, you should always test your setup to ensure that there aren't any light leak surprises. In my original video on the Dayi 6x17 Panorama, I discussed 3 focal length options that I use to capture panoramic images. Those being the 90, 150, and 210mm focal lengths. You may be wondering if I still stand by those choices. Well, for the most part, yes. I still like the 150mm as my go-to focal length. However, one ostensible quirk is that the 150mm lens does crop the 6x17 down to a 6x16.5cm image, which changes the panoramic ratio to 2.75. That is something that I wasn't aware of until I started carefully comparing images taken with my 150mm lens to those taken with my 90mm lens. Specifically, I noticed that the full area of exposure of the panel back has these 4 semicircles at each of the corners in the images taken with the 90mm lens. In case you were wondering, these semicircles do not reduce the size of the usable portion of the panoramic image. It's still 6x17 centimeters. The point being is that somewhere between the 90 and the 150mm focal lengths, the image circle becomes mechanically cut off by the width of the rear standard. It's not a ridiculously huge deal for me, but it is something that you may want to be aware of. In fact, the size of the opening of the rear standard is going to be the limiting factor of whether or not the full projection of the image circle reaches the film plane. The longer the focal length, the more the bellows has to be extended. Therefore, the greater the distance that the cone of light has to travel, which subsequently increases the likelihood that the image circle won't reach the far edges of the film plane. Let's use the 90 and 210mm focal lengths to drive this point home. Since the 90mm focal length requires a shorter bellows length to focus at infinity, the cone of light easily covers the entire film plane. In contrast, the 210mm focal length requires a far greater amount of bellows extension to focus at infinity. Therefore, the image circle, or cone of light, gets blocked by the confines of the rear standard, subsequently reducing the exposure of the film plane to the image circle. Therein lies the problem of using these kinds of accessory backs for panoramic photography. One can't simply use any focal length and expect to get a full 6x17 centimeter image. There will be compromises. If this sounds like a deal breaker for you, then a dedicated 6x17 panoramic camera will be your best option. I'll discuss this a bit more in my concluding thoughts. An important consideration with wide-angle lenses, no matter what format option you choose, is that of uneven illumination across the image circle. For the benefit of viewers who are unaware, most wide-angle lenses will be brighter in the center and progressively lose illumination towards the edges of the image circle. Hence, the need for a center ND filter to even the exposure out. In November of 2021, I was fortunate enough to secure a center ND filter specifically made for my Schneider Angulon 90mm lens, which has allowed me to use the 90mm lens without concern over having the edges of the image vignette and potentially make the images unusable. As a result of having this center ND filter, I have taken far more images using my 90mm lens. It has worked great with my Dayi Panoramic. But there's still one thing that makes me hesitant in using this lens on a consistent basis. It comes down to a personal preference in composition. I find that the 90mm lens is wide, but in several situations it is simply not wide enough to include sufficient foreground in the composition to give the image the appearance that you could just walk right into the scene and be immersed in it. I often find myself struggling to include both a bush or boulder in the foreground and include some background features of interest without cutting through some of the elements in the foreground with the edges of my frame. What do I do? Is more gear the answer? Interestingly, my friend Jay owns the 75mm focal length, and he let me take a peek on his 6x17 ground glass to get an understanding of the lens's potential. While I haven't purchased a 75mm lens because of the focusing limitations of my Zone 6 Studio's 4x5 camera, I do think I'd be much happier with a wider focal length because it's analogous to my favorite lens for my 8x10 setup, the Nikon Nikkor 150mm SW lens. If you'd like to see the visual impact on composition of that focal length, I'll leave a link to my review video that has examples of what I'm talking about in the description. These types of ultra wide angle lenses afford me the opportunity to place more emphasis on the foreground subject matter by getting closer to them while still including some interesting background elements in the scene. For the most part, that's my favorite compositional technique. In contrast, I typically use the 150 and 210mm lenses to create more abstract and tight compositions of objects as opposed to grand landscape vistas. For me, I find that these particular focal lengths don't give me a sufficient amount of foreground, so up close and personal tends to work best for the kinds of images I like. You should be aware that using a 210mm focal length reduces the size of the image to about 6 by 15.7 centimeters, and of course changes the ratio of the panorama to about 2.62. So when it comes to lens choices, you really do have to experiment to determine the focal lengths that give you the panoramic ratio that you prefer. I think it goes without saying that this is not an issue with a dedicated panoramic camera. All lenses with sufficient image circles in combination with a dedicated panoramic camera will give you a 6 by 17 centimeter size image. That's not the case with this Dayi accessory Panoramic. That's a really important quirk to consider if you're pondering this as an option. Despite the aforementioned quirks, these types of Panoramics might arguably be the best budget-friendly option available on the market. I purchased my copy of the Dayi 6x17 Panoramic on September 26, 2013 for $400. That's $540 in 2024 dollars. In retrospect, that was a pretty good price in comparison to the roughly $800 you'll spend today. In contrast, if you want a brand new, fully dedicated view camera for 6x17, just like Nick Carver, you'll spend about $3,600 for the Shenhao. That's not as bad as some of the fixed lens and film plane versions of these cameras that can cost up to $10,000 used if you want a variety of lenses. I would speculate that for most of us, the price point of all these options will help us decide whether we're just experimenting with 6x17 or are fully committed to the format. For me, I would describe myself as having been an admirer of 6x17 over the last 11 years of owning this panel back. While I enjoy the 6x17 panoramic format, my passion for the ridiculously huge 8x10 format has superseded my desire to shoot on smaller formats. I basically have to intentionally and unwillingly leave my Chamonix Alpinus X camera at home so that I have no option but to shoot with my Zone 6 Studios 4x5 camera and Dayi back. This is exactly what I did in the fall of 2023 on my Zion National Park trip. I set out on a mission to shoot some of my expired 4x5 Fujifilm Velvia 100 and attempted to refine my vision of what I wanted out of my images from the east side washes of the park. I concluded that my images should include fall color, red sandstone walls, warm reflected light, and a winding path that leads your eye through the scene. On my trip, I began thinking that the 4x5 ratio was restricting my ability to meet my goals and setting me up for disappointment. However, along the way, I started to realize that the 6x17 ratio might just help me complete my goal. Well, are you ready to see how I did? Okay, here goes. On my trip, I exposed one roll of Fujifilm Velvia 50, one roll of Fujifilm Pro 160NS, and one roll of Fujifilm Pro 400H. Let's start with the roll of Velvia 50. These 4 images have varying degrees of fall color, red sandstone, warm reflected light, and winding paths. So from a technical standpoint, I've included the elements that I was after. However, the only scene that really captures my attention is this one. It's moody, makes me feel at peace, and captures the elements of Zion National Park that come to mind whenever I think of being there. I also really enjoy the fact that the tree branches create a visual funnel leading me to explore deeper into this scene. Are you wondering whether I'm going to print this image ridiculously huge? The answer is a hard no! Why? There are a few reasons. One is that the flare towards the left middle of the frame is distracting and reduces the contrast. The other is that I think that there's too much negative space towards the far right of the image. This is a scene that I'll revisit in the future and reshoot only if the conditions are right. And I'll probably shoot it on 8x10 film, but with a crop in mind. More about my rationale for this approach in my concluding thoughts. Here are the images from my Fujifilm Pro 160NS roll, which was discontinued in October 2021. These 4 images definitely don't conform to my intended goals, but there are some interesting compositional elements that pique my interest. For example, in this image, I like how the 2 boulders on the left command my attention and are counterbalanced by the negative space on the right. I think this scene would benefit greatly from reflected light, especially since this color negative film has a more muted color profile. By far, my favorite image on this roll is the abstract scene of these trees set against a red sandstone backdrop with very subtle reflected light. There is something very calming and pleasing about it that really draws me into this photograph. This image could make for a really nice, reasonably sized print somewhere in my family's home. I'll have to play around with this scene a bit more before I make a final decision. The last roll of film I have to share with all of you is the very magenta-oriented Fujifilm Pro 400H, which has also been discontinued as of January 2021. Here's yet another roll that doesn't meet my intended goals, and quite frankly, doesn't excite me either. I probably make it seem like I absolutely hate my work, right? Just keep in mind that my focus with my landscape photography is to make a handful of ridiculously huge prints from my family's home. So I need to be ridiculously picky, or I'll end up with an eyesore on the wall that I'll scoff at every time I walk by it. I already have one of those, and I don't need another. An interesting note about this particular section of the wash is that it has the most intense reflected light glow that I've ever witnessed in Zion National Park. It is really ostensibly visible and mesmerizing in person. You gotta see it to believe it. Alright, this video has gone on far too long. Let's get on with my closing thoughts about the Dayi 6x17 panel back. Is it a good purchase for someone who is interested in experimenting with this format and already owns a 4x5 view camera with a Graflok back? Absolutely. Yes. You'll get your 6x17 kicks with this back. What about someone who is discerning and enthusiastically serious about 6x17? Does it make sense to make this purchase? Not really. While it will certainly get you going, in my humble opinion, the limitations of the Dayi back that I discussed earlier will narrow your flexibility and more than likely will result in you desiring more. I think that a dedicated 6x17 camera will provide you with a much more fulfilling experience despite the substantially higher initial cost. If you're that serious about 6x17, then I would just get a dedicated 6x17 camera. Would I personally still purchase this unit today? The short answer is no. While I enjoy the panoramic format, my addiction to the 8x10 size format supersedes any interest that I have in 6x17. I would rather just shoot an entire piece of 8x10 film and crop it down to a 4x10 panel if that was the look I was after. But I'm not like most film photographers, and therefore the context of my experience and opinion should be considered carefully before you decide what's right for you. Ask yourself, what am I going to do with all these images I shoot? Books? Prints? Social media? I have a very defined focus of the subject matter I shoot and why I shoot. I want to print ridiculously huge, so the kinds of prints I make benefit from the added resolution of the 8x10 format, especially if I choose to crop. So I'm biased towards the 8x10 format. Stop the press! I'm not bashing the 6x17 format in any way. It's a wonderful and interesting way of viewing the world. I enjoy viewing these panoramic images. I'm merely stating that if I'm going to commit to photographing a scene, my time and effort are better served by capturing an image on an 8x10 piece of film because it's better suited to helping me achieve my goals with film photography. In the end, only you can decide where you are in the spectrum of seriousness for the 6x17 format and how it fits your style of shooting. Have you used the Dayi 6x17 panel back? Please share your experience with our community so that all of us can benefit from your wisdom. If you've enjoyed watching this video, please hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, and consider using my Amazon links in the description for any item that you are intending to purchase so that I can continue to grow this channel. As always, thanks for watching.